I need to get this out because honestly, I'm still processing what just happened. Some of you might think I'm a monster by the end of this, but I don't care anymore. When I was 10 years old, my dad took me to Denny's for what he called a special dinner. I was excited because we rarely went out to eat, and I thought maybe things were getting better after Mom died 6 months earlier. I ordered pancakes because that's what kids do at Denny's, and he just sat there watching me eat with this weird expression I couldn't read at the time. When I finished, he slid a napkin across the table with a $20 bill folded inside. I asked him what it was for, thinking maybe it was early birthday money or something. That's when he stood up and said the words that basically shaped who I am today. "This should last you. You're not my problem anymore." I didn't understand what he meant. I was 10. I followed him outside, asking what he was talking about. When he got to his beat-up Ford Explorer, he locked the doors. I'm standing there, pounding on the window, screaming for him not to leave me. And this man, my own father, rolls down the window just enough to tell me that my dead mother would be disgusted by me because I was just like her junkie sister. Then he added the cherry on top. He had a real family now, and I shouldn't try to find them. He drove away while I was still screaming in that parking lot. The night manager at Denny's called CPS around 2 a.m. after I'd been hiding under tables for hours. I spent 3 days sleeping in the restaurant before they could get someone to pick me up. Those 3 days taught me everything I needed to know about depending on other people. Don't. Foster care wasn't terrible, but it wasn't home either. I bounced around a few places before landing with Dean and Nova, who were decent people. They helped me finish high school and get into community college. I worked 2 jobs, saved every penny, and transferred to a 4-year university on academic scholarships. I graduated with a business degree, started working in logistics, and worked my way up to operations manager at a shipping company. Every single day for the past 14 years, I've thought about that moment at Denny's, not in some sad, broken way, in a cold, calculating way. I always knew he'd come back eventually. Men like him always do when their luck runs out, so I prepared for it. I bought a house, got my finances in order, built a life that's completely mine. Not because I wanted to prove anything to him, but because I wanted to be ready when he inevitably showed up with his hand out. And 3 weeks ago, he did exactly that. My phone started blowing up with texts from a number I didn't recognize. At first I thought it was spam, but then I saw the messages, 73 texts in 2 hours, all from dear old Dad. He found my number somehow, probably through one of those people search websites, since I never bothered hiding my information. Why would I? I'm not the one who should be ashamed. The messages started desperate and got worse from there. He's apparently dying of liver failure. Real shocking for a guy who chose alcohol over his own kid. He's homeless now, sleeping in his car, and somehow convinced himself that I owed him something. The best part, he kept mentioning some account I supposedly promised him. An account that's apparently empty now, and it's somehow my fault. Here's the thing that really gets me. He actually thought I'd help him. After everything he did, after abandoning a 10-year-old kid in a restaurant parking lot, he genuinely believed I'd open my wallet and bail him out of the consequences of his own choices. The sheer audacity of it would be impressive if it wasn't so pathetic. I didn't respond to the texts, not yet, because I've been planning for this moment for 14 years, and I'm not about to waste it on a quick go-to-hell message. This man destroyed my childhood, made me grow up thinking I was worthless, and turned me into someone who can't trust anyone completely. He doesn't get to just text his way back into my life when it's convenient for him. But here's where it gets interesting. Yesterday he escalated, started calling instead of texting. When I didn't answer, he left voicemails. Long, rambling voicemails where he's crying, begging, trying to guilt-trip me about family loyalty. In one of them, he actually had the nerve to say he was sorry for how things ended between us. Like it was some mutual disagreement instead of him literally abandoning his child. The last voicemail was different. Though less begging, more demanding, he said he knew where I worked, knew I had money now, and that I owed him because he's my father. That got my attention real quick, not because I was scared, but because it told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to play out. See, I spent 14 years learning everything I could about Alan Mackenzie, that's my father's name, for anyone keeping track. Where he lived, who he was with, what his situation was. It's amazing what you can find out about someone when you're patient and persistent. I know about his second wife, Anna, who left him 5 years ago. I know about his stepkids who want nothing to do with him now. I know about his drinking problem that cost him 3 jobs. I know about the debts he's racked up and the bridges he's burned. Most importantly, I know he's not just homeless by accident. He's homeless because he burned through every relationship and opportunity he had, just like he did with me. The difference is those people had the luxury of walking away when they figured out what kind of person he really was. I didn't get that choice at 10 years old, but I have choices now, and I've been thinking very carefully about what those choices should be. Tomorrow, I'm supposed to meet with him. Yeah, you heard that right. I finally responded to one of his messages and agreed to meet, not because I forgive him or want to help him, but because I think it's time we had a real conversation about consequences. He wants to see his son who made something of himself? Fine. But he's going to learn exactly what kind of man his abandonment created. I'll update you all on how it goes. Something tells me it's going to be a very educational experience for both of us. The comments on my last post were incredible. Shout out to everyone who told me to stay strong and not let him manipulate me. You were absolutely right about what was coming. So I met with Alan yesterday at a coffee shop downtown. I picked the location because it's public, well lit, and has security cameras. Yeah, I'm that paranoid about this man, but 14 years of planning taught me to think ahead. He showed up 20 minutes early, which told me he was desperate. I watched him through the window before going in, and honestly, he looked exactly like what you'd expect from a guy who's been living in his car, worn-out clothes, stubble, that particular kind of tired that comes from burning every bridge you've ever crossed. But here's the thing that really got to me. He still had that same arrogant posture, even homeless and begging. He sat there like he was doing me a favor by showing up. That told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation was going to go. I sat down across from him and just waited. Let him start talking first, because I wanted to hear exactly how he was going to try to spin this situation. And man, did he deliver. He started with the fake emotional stuff. How sorry he was, how he'd made mistakes, how losing my mother messed him up more than he realized. Standard deadbeat dad playbook, right? But then he got to the real reason he was there. He needed $15,000 to get back on his feet. Apparently, that's what it costs to fix his life now. I just stared at him while he explained his whole sob story. How his second wife, Anna, took everything when she left. How his stepkids turned against him. How he'd been trying to get his life together but kept running into obstacles. Everything was someone else's fault. Of course, never once did he take actual responsibility for abandoning a 10-year-old kid. When he finished his little speech, I finally spoke up. I told him I remembered our last conversation very clearly. Every single word he said to me in that Denny's parking lot. How he called me worthless. How he said Mom would be disgusted by me. How he told me he had a real family now. The look on his face when I repeated his exact words back to him was priceless. Like he genuinely thought I might have forgotten or forgiven what he did. This man actually believed a traumatized kid would just get over being abandoned by his only remaining parent. He tried to backtrack then, started making excuses about how he was grieving, not thinking clearly, didn't mean those things. But I cut him off and asked him point blank, if you didn't mean it, why didn't you come back? Why didn't you call? Why didn't you check on me even once in 14 years? That's when his real personality started showing through. He got defensive, started talking about how hard it was for him to lose my mother, how he was dealing with his own problems, how I wouldn't understand because I was just a kid. Then he had the nerve to say that maybe if I'd been less difficult, he would have been able to handle things better. There it was. Even after 14 years, he was still blaming a 10-year-old child for his own failures as a father. I let him keep talking because I wanted to hear all of it. He went on about how he'd always planned to come back for me when he got his life sorted out, but things kept getting complicated, how he thought about me all the time, but didn't know how to reach out. More lies stacked on top of lies, but then he started getting angry when he realized I wasn't buying any of it. He told me I owed him because he was my father, because family is supposed to help family, because blood is thicker than water. The same man who told me I wasn't his problem anymore was now lecturing me about family, loyalty. That's when I decided to tell him about my research, how I'd spent years learning about his life after he left me, how I knew about Anna leaving him because of his drinking, How I knew about the stepkids who stopped talking to him after he missed their graduations and birthdays because he was too drunk to show up. How I knew about every job he'd lost and every relationship he'd destroyed. His face went completely white when he realized I knew everything. But instead of being ashamed, he got mad. Started yelling about how I had no right to spy on him. How it was creepy and obsessive. How I needed to let the past go and focus on helping him now. I just laughed at him. This man who abandoned his own child was calling me obsessive for keeping track of the consequences of his choices. The lack of self-awareness was genuinely impressive. Then he played what he thought was his trump card. He told me he was dying, that the liver failure was real, and that this was my last chance to have a relationship with my father. He actually started crying, talking about how he wanted to make things right before it was too late. But here's what he didn't understand. I've been waiting 14 years for this exact moment, not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I wanted him to face what he'd done. And I was ready for every manipulation tactic he tried to use. I told him I wasn't going to give him money, not $15,000, not $500, not $15. I explained that he'd made his choice when he drove away from that Denny's. And now he gets to live with the consequences of that choice. He immediately switched back to anger, started demanding to know how I could be so heartless to my own father, asked me what kind of man turns his back on family when they need help. The irony was completely lost on him, but then he said something that really showed his true colors. He told me that if I didn't help him, he'd make sure everyone knew what kind of son I really was. He'd tell my coworkers, my neighbors, anyone who would listen, that I abandoned my dying father. He actually threatened to ruin my reputation because I wouldn't bail him out of his own mistakes. That's when I realized this meeting had given me everything I needed. He'd shown me exactly who he still was, the same selfish, manipulative person who'd abandoned a grieving child 14 years ago. Nothing had changed except his circumstances. I stood up to leave, and he grabbed my arm, started begging again, promising he'd changed, swearing he'd pay me back if I just gave him this one chance. But I just pulled away and walked out. Here's the thing, though. I'm not done with Alan McKenzie. Not even close. See, threatening to ruin my reputation was a mistake on his part, because it told me he still thinks he has power over me. He doesn't realize that I've spent 14 years building a life specifically designed to be immune to his manipulations. But more importantly, he just handed me the perfect justification for what comes next. If he wants to play games with my reputation, then it's time he learned what real consequences look like. I'll update you all on how this develops, because something tells me our story is just getting started. You guys, I'm actually impressed by how predictable this man is. Remember how he threatened to ruin my reputation if I didn't give him money? Well, he wasn't bluffing. Monday morning, I got pulled into my supervisor's office. Apparently, someone had called the company over the weekend, claiming to be a family member with concerns about my character. They told HR that I was heartless, enough to abandon my dying father, and that they questioned whether someone like that could be trusted in a position of responsibility. My supervisor, Archer, was actually pretty cool about it. He said the call seemed weird and manipulative, but company policy required him to at least mention it to me. When I explained the situation, obviously leaving out the revenge planning part, he just shook his head and said, "Some people never learn when to quit." But that wasn't the end of it. Alan also managed to track down my neighbor somehow. Mrs. Willow from next door came over Tuesday evening, looking concerned. She said a man claiming to be my father had been going door to door, telling people I was refusing to help him in his time of need. He was apparently really laying it on thick about being abandoned by his ungrateful son. The thing is, this actually made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly Alan. Even when he's desperate and homeless, he still thinks the solution is to manipulate other people into fighting his battles for him. He genuinely believed that if he made enough people think badly of me, I'd cave and give him what he wanted. What he didn't count on was that I've spent 14 years building genuine relationships with people who actually know who I am. Archer has worked with me for 3 years and knows I'm reliable and honest. Mrs. Willow has watched me shovel her driveway every winter and help her carry groceries. These people weren't going to turn on me because some stranger showed up with a sob story. But Alan's little reputation campaign told me something important. He was getting desperate enough to escalate. And that meant it was time for me to stop being reactive and start being proactive. See, I told you guys I'd spent years researching his life, but I didn't mention everything I'd learned. When you really dig into someone's history, you find out all sorts of interesting things, like how Alan had been getting disability payments for a back injury for the past 2 years. Not illegal, except I had photos from Anna's Facebook before she made it private, showing him helping his stepson move a piano just 6 months ago. Or how he'd been claiming his current address as a friend's couch for government assistance purposes, when really he'd been staying in an extended stay motel until the money ran out. Again, not technically illegal, but definitely the kind of thing assistance programs take seriously. Most interesting of all was discovering that Anna hadn't just left him because of his drinking. She'd left because he'd been stealing money from his stepkid's college funds to pay for his alcohol. Not illegal, since his name was on the accounts, but the kind of thing that explained why those kids wanted nothing to do with him. Now, I'm not saying I was planning to use any of this information. I'm just saying that when someone threatens your livelihood and reputation, it's good to know what kind of person you're really dealing with. Wednesday night, Alan showed up at my house, just knocked on my front door at 9 p.m. like he had every right to be there. When I opened it, he was standing there with this mixture of desperation and rage that I recognized from that day at Denny's. He started yelling immediately about how I was just like my mother, selfish and heartless, how he'd raised me better than this, how family was supposed to stick together no matter what. The whole time he's gesturing wildly and clearly had been drinking. I just stood there and let him rant. When he finally ran out of steam, I told him very calmly that his little campaign to ruin my reputation had failed, that the people in my life actually knew who I was, unlike him, and that if he kept harassing me, my employer, or my neighbors, I was going to start making some phone calls of my own. That's when he really lost it, started screaming about how I couldn't threaten him, how he was my father and I owed him respect, how he'd make sure everyone knew what kind of monster I really was. Then he shoved me. It wasn't hard enough to knock me down or anything, but it was enough. I pulled out my phone and started recording while telling him he needed to leave my property immediately. He tried to grab the phone, but I stepped back and kept filming while he continued his meltdown. The whole thing lasted maybe 5 more minutes before he stormed off. But I had it all on video, a grown man having a drunken tantrum on my doorstep, shoving his son and making threats because he couldn't manipulate me into giving him money. After he left, I sat in my living room thinking about what just happened. This man had now threatened my job, harassed my neighbors, and gotten physical with me on my own property, all because I wouldn't bail him out of the consequences of his own choices. That's when I realized something. For 14 years I'd been angry about what he did to me as a child. But watching him self-destruct in real time, I wasn't angry anymore. I was just disappointed. This pathetic man throwing tantrums was what I'd built my entire adult life around preparing for. But then I thought about that scared 10-year-old kid in the Denny's parking lot. And the anger came back, not the cold. Calculating anger I'd been carrying around, but something hotter, more immediate. This man had destroyed that kid's sense of safety and worth. And now he wanted to waltz back in and do it again to the adult that kid had become. That's when I decided Alan Mackenzie was going to learn what real consequences felt like. Thursday morning, I made my first phone call to the disability office just to report that I'd seen someone claiming to have a disabling back injury doing some pretty heavy lifting. I didn't mention it was my father, just a concerned citizen reporting potential fraud. Then I called the office that handles housing assistance. Again, just a concerned citizen who'd noticed someone claiming an address where they didn't actually live. Very civic-minded of me, right? By Friday afternoon, Alan was blowing up my phone again. But this time, the messages weren't asking for money or threatening my reputation. This time, he was panicking because apparently some government offices wanted to review his case and were asking if I knew anything about it. I didn't respond, just like I didn't respond when he showed up at my work on Saturday morning, demanding to know what I'd done. Security escorted him off the property, and I made sure they had a copy of the video from my doorstep in case he came back. The best part, I haven't broken a single law or done anything unethical. I've just been a concerned citizen reporting things I observed, things that happened to contradict what he'd been telling various government agencies. Sunday night, I got one more message from him. This time he wasn't angry or demanding or threatening. This time he was begging, saying he understood now that I was serious, that he'd gone too far, that he just wanted to work something out. But here's the thing Alan doesn't understand. This isn't about working something out. This isn't about money or forgiveness or second chances. This is about a 10-year-old kid who deserved better, and a 24-year-old man who's tired of letting the person who hurt that kid get away with it. I'm not done with him yet. Not even close. Well, guys, this is probably going to be my last update on this situation. Alan Mackenzie finally learned what happens when you spend 14 years underestimating someone. And honestly, watching it all unfold has been both satisfying and deeply unsettling in ways I didn't expect. After my last post, things moved pretty quickly. Those government agencies I contacted were apparently more thorough than I expected. Turns out when you report potential fraud, they actually investigate it properly. Who knew? Within a week, Alan's disability payments got suspended pending review. The housing assistance got cut off entirely after they discovered he'd been lying about his living situation for months. And apparently, when they started digging deeper, they found some other inconsistencies in his applications that I hadn't even known about. Seems like lying to one government agency makes them all want to take a closer look at your paperwork. But the real turning point came last Tuesday. Alan showed up at my workplace again, despite being banned from the property after his last visit. This time, he wasn't just angry or desperate. He was completely unhinged. I was in the break room when security called to tell me there was someone in the parking lot screaming about how I destroyed his life, how I was an ungrateful monster, how he was going to make sure everyone knew what I really was. I went to the window and watched him pacing back and forth between the cars, yelling at anyone who would listen. A few of my co-workers gathered around to see what was happening, and I had to explain that the homeless man having a breakdown in our parking lot was my father. That was a fun conversation. Security called the police this time instead of just escorting him off. When the officers arrived, Alan was still ranting about how his own son had stabbed him in the back and ruined everything he'd worked for. The irony was completely lost on him, of course. Here's a man who abandoned his 10-year-old child, talking about betrayal like he's the victim in this situation. But here's where it got really interesting. While they were talking to him, Alan started going off about how none of this was his fault, how he'd been a good father until my mother died and I became too difficult to handle, how he'd tried to give me a better life by finding me a new family, how everything that happened was really my fault for being such a problem child. The officers just stared at him while he basically confessed to abandoning a 10-year-old kid and then blamed the kid for it. One of them asked him to clarify what he meant by finding you a new family, and Alan actually said he'd done me a favor by leaving me somewhere safe where people could take care of me properly, like Denny's at 10 p.m. was. Some kind of child care service. When they asked me if I wanted to press charges for harassment, I said yes, not because I was angry anymore, but because I was tired of him thinking there were no consequences for his actions. Watching him get handcuffed in front of my co-workers was surreal. This man who'd loomed so large in my nightmares for 14 years suddenly looked small and pathetic, struggling against the restraints. They arrested him right there in my work parking lot. My co-workers who witnessed the whole thing were completely stunned. Archer pulled me aside afterward and said he'd never seen anything like it. A grown man having a complete meltdown while blaming his own child for his failures. He told me to take the rest of the day off if I needed it, but honestly I felt fine, calm even, like something that had been building pressure for years had finally been released. But that wasn't the end of it. While Alan was sitting in jail waiting for his hearing, I got a visitor I wasn't expecting. Anna, his ex-wife, tracked down my contact information through social media. She sent me a message asking if we could talk, saying she had information I needed to hear. We met at a different coffee shop. I wasn't about to go back to the scene of my last conversation with Alan. Anna looked tired but determined, like someone who'd been carrying around a secret for too long. She didn't want to get involved in our drama, she said, but she needed to tell me something important. Apparently, after Alan got arrested, word got around to his old neighborhood. Anna said she'd been getting calls from people asking if the man on the police report was the same Alan Mackenzie who used to live there. That's when she realized other people needed to know what kind of person they were dealing with. She told me everything, about the money he'd stolen from his stepkid's college funds to pay for his alcohol habit, about how he'd convinced her it was just a temporary loan and then spent it all on whiskey and beer, about how he'd manipulated her into thinking it was somehow her fault for not being more understanding, about about his grief over my mother, but the most important thing she told me was about his pattern. How he'd done this same thing to his first wife, my mother. How he'd started drinking heavily after she got pregnant with me. How he'd blamed her for ruining his plans. How he'd made her feel like everything was her fault right up until the day she died. Anna said my mother had confided in her sister before she passed away, told her that Alan resented having a child, that he felt trapped by the responsibility, that he'd been saying for months that his life would be better if he could start over somewhere else. My mother had been planning to leave him and take me with her, but the cancer took her before she could make it happen. That's when I finally understood why he'd abandoned me so easily. It wasn't because I was difficult, or because he was grieving. It wasn't even really about me at all. It was because I reminded him of her, and he'd spent years convincing himself that she'd ruined his life by getting sick and dying, and leaving him with a kid he never wanted in the first place. Abandoning me wasn't a moment of weakness or poor judgment. It was the logical conclusion of years of resentment and blame that he'd been building up since before I was even born. He'd been looking for an excuse to walk away from his responsibilities, and my mother's death gave him the perfect opportunity. Anna didn't owe me that information, but she said she couldn't let him keep destroying people and getting away with it. She'd watched him do it to her family, and she wasn't going to stay silent while he tried to do it to me. She also mentioned that his stepkids, Aaron and Mackenzie, had never gotten their college money back. They'd both had to take out massive loans and work multiple jobs to pay for school because their stepfather had stolen their futures to feed his addiction. The harassment charges stuck. Alan got 6 months probation and a restraining order that keeps him from contacting me or coming anywhere near my home or workplace. His appeals for the disability and housing decisions were denied after the investigators found evidence of the fraud I'd reported. Last I heard, he was staying at a shelter downtown and still insisting that everyone else was the problem. But here's the thing that really surprised me. I don't feel vindicated or satisfied or triumphant. I just feel empty. Not sad empty, just neutral empty. Like a weight I'd been carrying around for 14 years finally got put down, and now I'm not sure what to do with my hands. For so long I'd built my entire adult life around being ready for this confrontation. I'd made decisions about my career, my relationships, my finances, all with this idea that someday Alan would come back and I'd be ready for him. I'd chosen jobs that gave me financial security. I'd bought a house that was completely mine. I'd kept detailed records of everything just in case. And now that it's over, I'm realizing how much energy I spent on someone who never deserved it. The funniest part is that Alan destroyed himself. I didn't have to do anything except tell the truth about what I observed. All those years I spent planning and preparing for revenge, and in the end, he handed me everything I needed just by being himself. His own arrogance and entitlement became his downfall. He wanted to threaten my reputation. I let him show everyone exactly who he really was. He wanted to manipulate me with guilt and family obligation. I let him explain to the police how he'd abandoned a 10-year-old child. He wanted to play victim. I let him demonstrate what actual consequences look like when you spend decades burning bridges and lying to people. My co-workers have been incredibly supportive through all this. Archer made sure everyone knew that if Alan showed up again, they should call security immediately and not engage with him. Mrs. Willow from next door brought me a casserole and told me she was proud of me for standing up to him. Even people I barely know have been checking in to make sure I'm okay. The strangest part has been the dreams. For 14 years, I've had the same nightmare at least once a week, being back in that Denny's parking lot, watching him drive away while I scream for him to come back. But since the arrest, the dreams have changed. Now I dream about that scared 10-year-old kid, but instead of being abandoned, he's being picked up by Dean and Nova. He's getting a second chance at having a real family. I think that's when I realized something important. The 10-year-old kid who got left in that Denny's parking lot deserved justice. Not revenge, not vindication, just simple justice. And sometimes justice looks like letting someone face the natural consequences of their own choices without anyone there to bail them out. I'm done with Alan Mackenzie, not because I forgive him or because I've moved on or because I've found peace. I'm done with him because he's not worth any more of my time or energy. He's a sad, pathetic man who destroys everything he touches. And the best thing I can do is make sure he never gets the chance to touch my life again. But I'm also done carrying around all that anger and resentment. It served its purpose. It kept me motivated and focused and prepared, but now it's just dead weight, and I'm ready to put it down. I've got a good job, a nice house, people who care about me, and a future that's entirely my own. That 10-year-old kid in the parking lot would be amazed by what his life became despite everything. To everyone who followed this story and gave me support, thank you. You helped me realize that I wasn't crazy for being angry, and you helped me see that some people really don't deserve second chances. The comments about staying strong and not letting him manipulate me were spot on. You guys saw right through his tactics from the beginning. Alan wanted a relationship with his successful son. Well, he got one, just not the kind he was expecting. He got to see exactly what that abandoned kid grew up to become. Someone who doesn't need his approval, doesn't fear his threats, and doesn't owe him anything. This is over now. Finally, and for the first time in 14 years, I'm looking forward instead of backward.